Well, my great-grandmother came from Ireland. She was born in Ireland. She came evidently to New York and evidently met my great-grandfather because he was from New York. And in my family history that my cousin did, they started coming across the United States, coming this way, you know. And I can't believe how many children she had that died. You know, of course, back then things did, you know. They didn't have, if you had the measles or chicken pox or you died, they didn't have vaccinations against, you know, things back then. And they eventually came across until they ended up in Pueblo. And my grandfather had a meat market, and I think he had like a bar or some other type of business, two businesses in Pueblo. I know my grandmother, they were very knowledgeable about meat. When we'd go to the grocery store, the poor butcher, he'd catch hell if it didn't suit him, you know. And so anyway, he had the two businesses. Well, they found gold up in Crested Butte. And so he decided he would go prospecting for gold. So he sold the two businesses, got $10,000, which back there was a lot of money. And he went up there, and I don't know if she went with him or the kids, because they'd lost kids all this trip across, you know, every time. I couldn't believe in the family history how many children she'd lost, you know. And so I don't know if she went with him or whatever. And evidently that he lost his money, I think. So they came to Victor. And I think he worked at a mine. My grandmother, she liked to dance, you know, and they used to have dances every Saturday or someplace, you know, and they'd go to them. And my grandfather came here from Illinois, and she met him at this dance. And so they married, and he was working at the mine, and they lived, the house is still up on Squaw Mountain where we lived, you know. And they got married, and she had 4 girls and a boy. Let's see, my Catherine, Ruth, Catherine, Etta, and but no, she had 3 girls, Catherine and Etta and Ruth, and then Buddy, boy. But anyway, when they were young, those kids were young, my grandfather was working in the mine, of course, and he got hit in the side with some piece of equipment or machinery or something, and it caused a huge lump in his side, which was probably cancer, you know, but back then they didn't know a lot of stuff about that stuff, and he died. So then she had a restaurant down in Victor. You know where the mine offices are now, the building? Well, between that building and the visitor center, there's a building on the back side of the post office building. I was looking for that picture because I've got a perfect picture of it, but you think I could find it? No. A picture of me out in front of it when I was 3 years old. My first one, you know, the first husband, he died, and then she was married to another man, and they divorced. And then she married the 3rd time to this man called Pete Call, and her house is still up there on Squaw, and up in back of it there's a little cabin, like just a little 1-room thing. And it was always closed off. You know, I don't know what it was ever used for or why or whatever, but us kids were always told not to go up there. Well, of course, we went up there and looked in there, you know. There was a stove in there, and there was a bed for one person, you know, probably one of the miners slept there, because they took in boarders then. See, when my grandfather died, they didn't have Social Security or workman's compensation or anything. She took in boarders and you know, took care of them, cooked for them and things. And so I think probably somebody like that had lived in that cabin. But we were always told not to go in there. Of course, we looked it over and knew what it looked like in there. And my aunt lived down below my grandmother, and she didn't have a wash machine. So she came up to my grandmother's and we did laundry. Well, that was a good thing when us kids too, because we could play in the water, take the clothes out and put them in the wringer, you know. And so during this time there was this loud noise, and I remember my grandmother stopping and looking at my aunt, and she said, "What do you think that was?" Yeah, of course, with the mines, you never know. They could be blasting or doing God only knows what. So,
Yes.
so nobody got real excited. She just said, wondered what it could be, and nobody had any idea. Went on with the laundry. So my other aunt lived down on 6th Street, and she was pregnant, and she walked up to my grandmother's house to visit that afternoon, and they were standing out there. Catherine was getting ready to go home, and we were standing out there, and I was playing along. There was a brick wall about this high out there I was sitting on and listening to them, and they were talking. And Granny looked up there at that cabin, and she said, "That door is open up there, or not shut." She said, "Have you kids been in there?" And I said, "No, not recently, we hadn't. I didn't know anything about it." So she went up there. She said to Catherine, she said, "Let me go up there and shut that door. You know, I don't want it open and blowing in the breeze." Oh my God, she came out of there screaming. Her husband had shot himself in there.
Oh my goodness.
I can
Terrible.
still see that all happening. Well, Etta come running out of the house. She was pregnant, and she come running out of the house, and we had never had a phone. Titmuses that lived down below us, they had a phone. So Granny told Etta to run down to Titmus's and call Dr. Denman, because she didn't know for sure if he was dead or, you know, what. And then somebody called the police, and all the hullabaloo come, you know, because he had died. And so that was her third husband. Well, her name was Martha. They called her Maddie, and then Catherine, and then Etta was the baby. In between, I think after my mother, there was Buddy, the boy. His name was Eno, too, just like his dad, but we called him Buddy. And then Catherine and Etta. Yeah, that's where I was born. My grandmother, she had that restaurant across the street, but she had boarding houses. And she had one that evidently had that floor up there rented or something, and had boarders up there because she was a widow, you know. And like I said, there was no, and so she had of course, and by then my mother and them, they were growing up, you know, they weren't little kids or anything. And my Etta was the youngest when she was the baby, and Ruth, my mother, was the oldest one, and then Catherine and Buddy were in between. And so my mother woke him up that morning, and she had to tell my grandmother she was pregnant and was having a baby. And I said to Etta, when Etta told me about this, my mother never would talk about anything. Etta would tell me things. If I wanted to know, I asked Etta. And so I said, well, how could my mother be pregnant and having a baby and she didn't know it? I mean, you know, I thought she would show. My mother was inclined to be heavy, but I thought that would show, you know. And she said, we just thought she had put on a little weight. We didn't really think anything about it. And so they had to tell Granny that she was in labor and having a baby. So we never had a car, we never had a telephone. She ran up to the hospital where Dr. Denman was living. He and his wife lived in the old hospital. She ran up there and got him out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning. He told me this himself after. He said she was beating on the damn door. I went down there and Ruth's having a baby, and I didn't even know she was pregnant. So he went down, and they pronounced everything okay. She had the baby, me, and so my Uncle Buddy was there. And back then, I know there was another family that was friends of our family. They did this, but sometimes when girls had children out of wedlock, you know, they put them up for adoption, or say, in this instance, the man's wife died in childbirth and left him with 4 children. to raise. And he thought, you know, how can I go to work and I've got 4 kids to take care of? Then they were young, they weren't little, you know, not growing up, they were little kids. And so he put them up for adoption. And so I guess Granny told me some people did go and adopt a couple of those kids, you know. Women that found out they couldn't have a baby, they adopted a couple of those kids. So my grandmother's thinking, you know, who's going to take care of this, and who's going to pay the bills, and you know, all the things that you think about. And so she was going to do that with me, you know, that she would make it known that I had been born and that I was available for adoption if anybody was interested. And my Uncle Buddy, Etta stepped up and said, no, you're not going to do that. He said, I will take care of her. I will give you money or take, and thank God he did, but he died in the war. So anyway, so that's why I stayed with him. Well, then her place was in that building there on that alley. Mm-hmm. And every once in a while in the course of conversations, I'd hear things about the broken dishes. And I thought, what the hell have broken dishes got to do with anything, you know? And finally one day, like I said, my grandmother wouldn't talk about anything, or my mother either, or Catherine. They were too embarrassed with all the family things. So I asked Etta, I said, what are they talking about? And she said, well, we had dinner, and your Granny got ready to leave to go someplace that evening for something, and she told the two girls, or whoever was there, to clean up the kitchen and do the dishes. So when she came home, they're still sitting on the table. So she just opened the window and dumped them all out in the alley. Broke them all up. And I said, well, that was really smart. Break up all the damn dishes, you know.